Compliance Life, I visit with Bridget Abraham. Bridget is the CCO at Remitly. In this episode 1, we take a look at her college and early professional career. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and welcome to another edition of The Compliance Life. This month, I'm visiting with Bridget Abraham. And Bridget is a chief compliance officer, but she has a journey that's a little bit different than most chief compliance officers. She is assuredly not a lawyer and doesn't come from a legal background. So it's going to be a great exploration of Bridget, her journey and her story into the CCO chair. Bridget, first of all, welcome. And I'm very excited to be able to visit with you over this month's series.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Bridget, could you tell us a little bit about your academic background? You have an undergrad and master's, and then your early professional career.
Sure. I went off to college as the first in my family. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I didn't have a family background and path, but I was always very interested in numbers and history. And so when I went off to college, I discovered I really enjoyed economics and the study of financial performance in various industries. So I attended Colorado State University and I got my undergrad in economics with almost a minor, but I didn't claim it in math. And so I spent a lot of time working on numbers and others. And then I quickly went into getting my master's there as well and focused my research on agricultural economics, which was really about sustainability and the environment that had the impact that it had in small rural America, and what kind of research we could do focusing on the economics of small business and the importance of agriculture in those local communities. And through doing that's how I ended up actually at the Federal Reserve Bank, where I was presenting my research at various forums. And I started my career with the Federal Reserve Bank working on economic research. So I was a junior economist working on how we did research and focusing on the open market committee. So voting on the various interest rates and on things like that. I was one of those research analysts that led to focusing on how we determined interest rates. And there I also continued to focus on rural America and the importance of things like broadband and varied industry in local.
You are the very first CCO who has a master's in ag eco. Wow, very impressive. My dad taught it at an agricultural college, so I know what that is. But tell me about the Fed. My perception is it's a group of very intelligent, highly motivated individuals, very collaborative. Certainly you have your everyday run-of-the-mill conflicts, but it's something that people really tend to cherish their time there when I talk to them. Could you tell us a little bit about that part of your experience?
Working for the Federal Reserve is an incredible opportunity where you have the opportunity to learn so many various things. And you're right, you work with incredibly smart people who have an amazing background and an ability to think strategically and critically and laser focus, right, on the economy and other things like that. And the program there for the economic research and the junior economist is really geared to try to move you to a PhD, to a focus on economic policy and other areas. And so it's a really amazing training ground where you get to understand what gets put into all the important factors that get put into an economy and how important things like local banking is, retail markets, they all come together on determining how do you determine and set policy that's going to have the biggest impact on your local community. And you really do get to work with some really renowned people around the world that have a true passion for what they love to do. And they also offer an amazing training program around those things.
Which Federal Reserve Bank district did you work?
I worked in the 10th, so I worked for the Kansas City Fed.
And where did you move from the Fed?
During the Fed, so during that program, I decided my passion was not in doing research and writing papers. So I actually took the opportunity while I was at the Fed to move into banking supervision. So the Fed has the economic research side. And then, of course, as most people on this podcast would be familiar with, is the economic research and the supervision side. And so I wanted to learn more about all the nuances of banking and the balance sheet and the activities that they had. My family growing up had small rural banks in Kansas and Missouri. And so I always had an interest in it. And I took that opportunity and learned from there. And during that time, when I was at the Fed, it was right after 9/11 and the implementation of the Patriot Act. So that's how I started to get into compliance from the Fed. I was mostly focused on credit risk and looking at those types of activities at banks. But then everybody had to take a turn working on these new BSA requirements and examinations of these banks. And I started really being interested in it and learning about financial crimes and terrorist financing and how we identify some of that and work with banks to get on there. And then from there, I moved actually to New York City and started working in consulting and working with lots of large institutions in the New York City area, including Citi and many others that I eventually went to, on their overall BSA programs. So at that time, there was a lot of lookbacks in private banking and other things happening there to comply with the Patriot Act requirements.
Let me ask you about your time at the Fed in the banking supervision, where you were working with banks around what was the first, or it's not the first, but the Patriot Act, which enhanced the Bank Secrecy Act. Was that really a learning experience both for the Fed and for the Fed's customers, the banks, of implementing the regulations? Was it collaborative? What was that experience like for you and the Fed?
It was certainly a time where there were a lot of new requirements and new understanding of what we were looking for. And it really depended on the size of the bank and where they were located. I think there was more focus on medium to large size banks at that time and learning about what kind of controls really should be put in place to look for this type of activity. There were controls. There was KYC and there was certain things that we looked for to understand and know the customer. But that, especially in the community banks at the time, was something they knew about anyway, right? Because they were local banks. They really knew their customer and their client base. But growing that into monitoring to look for nefarious activity, whether it was their customers being scammed out of something or being involved in some sort of money laundering scheme, was new. It was collaborative. There was a lot of conversations and discussions, but it was a time where there weren't a lot of playbooks, exactly what to look for and what to put in place. So it was a lot of analysis to understand what could we be focusing on here? What would we be looking for? And how do we start to move those controls into the appropriate place?
Did banks at that point make the connection between illicit financing and terrorism? Was that something that was already in the wind or in the air, or was that an educational process, or almost, as you said, a conversation as well?
I think it was more of a conversation at the time on how they could used to move those monies and those funds. How could they look for it? I think there was obviously a recognition that the money flows through there, but I think it was changing the mindset to say, what do we have to proactively look for versus report when something happens to us at the bank? So how do we actually start looking for that in the future rather than reacting and closing down accounts and reporting it should we find something? And I think that was the conversation that was really starting to happen at that time.
And I've talked to several people who went into financing, financial controls, compliance, and other requirements that really came about because of 9/11. My sense in talking to them, there at that point in their careers, there was a recognition that this was important and this had to change, and that although they may not have been carrying a gun as a law enforcement officer, that banks and compliance officers around and people at the Fed even were on the front lines of a new fight in this, or defense in the war against terrorism. Did you all have that sense?
For the most part, yeah. I think particularly in some of the more medium to larger size institutions, understanding what role they play and not wanting to be caught helping to facilitate that activity, because there was such a deep scar and pain that was still happening with what happened in 9/11, and really seeing the impacts of that here in the US, I think made a big difference. So really wanting to be on the forefront for how we could all collectively identify that or prevent it from happening in the future.
So you said you went into the consulting world and then you went to New York and worked at financial institutions. Could I ask you a couple of questions about your work in the consulting world and how you found that experience?
I think the amazing advantage of working in the consulting space is being able to see so many institutions, and you often see them at a time where they're either in trouble or they're having difficulty doing something, meeting it, or even just putting the right resources together. And you get to learn a lot about what each institution is doing, how they're approaching looking at it, and you make so many connections across the board. And so I think that was an amazing learning experience, and then bringing some of your knowledge and expertise from seeing various activities at different institutions is a huge learning curve. I think when those banks or institutions worked really well was when they really brought in the consulting partner to help collaborate together to figure out and how to solve the problem. So I think the biggest advantage of working in that space is really just how much across all these different institutions and what issues they're dealing with, how some have resolved it, and learning those best practices across.
Join us next week on The Compliance Life, where I continue my exploration with Bridget Abraham about her journey to the CCO Chair. In episode 2, we take a look at her work at the Federal Reserve Bank and the consulting world.